to her, said that she's really, really sweet. And I'm Caitlin, and I'm 18.
Say your last name,
Oh,
too.
yeah, well, Caitlin Davies.
Okay, I'm Megan Davies. I'm Caitlin's twin, the younger twin, by 46 minutes.
Yep.
I'm 18 years old also. Tomorrow we graduate high school.
2 years ago, Caitlin Davies was diagnosed with clinical depression. Her identical twin, Megan, showed no symptoms of the illness. We asked the twins to record video diaries during the summer after they graduated from high school.
Yeah, you'll be practicing together that much. Is there anything you're feeling optimistic about?
The future. I'm excited to go off to college. That's good.
Are you taking a math class?
Caitlin, optimistic.
Well, I'm feeling optimistic about next year and the possibilities of the summer and things like that. But again, that's also for me a double-edged sword. It's also what I'm feeling pessimistic about and worried about next year, going off school. How am I going to be able to handle that?
Despite her depression, Caitlin maintained a straight-A average in high school and remains determined to go to college. But as she prepares to graduate, she finds herself spiraling downward once again.
Depression. It's not like having a bad day. There's just so much more to that. The exhaustion and the lack of focus, lack of motivation. It's just everything, because sadness is something that it's the easiest of all of those things to deal with, because there is an outlet for that. Like, how do you have an outlet for lack of motivation? How do you have an outlet for lack of focus? Like, lack of energy? Like, what can you do about that? At least with sadness, like, you can write, you can cry, but you can't do anything about all those. And it's just so much more than just emotional. It's so much more physical than what a lot of people think it is, because your body feels it. You feel down, you can't move, you can't get up and do what you want to do. And it doesn't matter how much you want to do something, you just can't.
At 18, Caitlin is waging a fight that could determine the course of her life. She must devote all her energy to getting well enough to leave home at the end of the summer.
In closing, let me just say this. This has been the opportunity of a lifetime to serve in this branch. It doesn't get any better than this. You know, time comes on, and I've decided that it was time for me to leave. I never imagined that I would get elected, and you know, it's been the best. Thanks very much.
Senator Robert Antonioni has served in the Massachusetts state legislature for 20 years. For most of that time, he was a very public man with a very private secret.
I think that my struggles with depression began in 1999 when my brother committed suicide. I had all sorts of feelings of guilt, responsibility, neglect that I carried with me. I felt very traumatized with my brother's death, and the way that I dealt with it most often was to remove myself from the normal daily events. And for a politician, that's not a good thing, because politicians don't get elected by removing themselves from the public. They get elected by being in the public. I would frequently go home. I would just curl up and burrow myself in. And I'd sleep, you know, excessively. I frequently would think, I just got to get a hold of myself and stop feeling this way. You know, real men don't cry. And if you're a real man, you'll get over it. Cut it out, get it together. I can remember one day in my office just sitting down crying, and my chief of staff said, "Bob, we got to do something about this." You know, that gave me the inclination that something had to be done here. You know, we had to deal with this. Yeah.
Bob sought the help of a psychotherapist. As he began to talk about the loss of his brother, he discovered something important about himself.
When I began therapy, I found it very hard to talk about what I was feeling because I was not accustomed to doing that. I had never opened up the way that I did with the therapist. Eventually, I came to understand that the hurt and the feelings that I had on a regular basis weren't just related to my brother's death, but that I had an issue with depression. And it had been there for a long time.
It's not bad to be sad or bad to be angry, but when you are persistently sad over a long period of time, and it's not about the moment, it's about something that happened, you know, that's a time when you have to say, well, what's going on with my mind and my body and my spirit?
I remember thinking, I'm having a bad week, you know, and then the bad week turned to a bad month, and then that turned to a bad year, and then it turned into a bad 4 years. And then I remember being absolutely terrified because I thought, have I turned a corner that I will never, ever be able to fix?
The most fascinating thing about depression is that you can't pin it down. You can't say it's just sadness. You're saddened by the fact that you're not in control of your thoughts. There's no desire to get out of bed and do things because you're not sure you can do them with any great sense of judgment or without any sense that that'll make you feel better.
Depression doesn't just change the way we feel, it actually changes the way we see the world. Dr. Ian Gottlieb, professor of psychology at Stanford University, is trying to understand just how deep these changes go. In one of his experiments, a group of women with a history of depression and a group of healthy control subjects watched faces on a computer screen. The faces started out with a neutral expression that slowly transformed into either a happy or a sad expression. The women were told to press a button as soon as they noticed the transformation. Gottlieb found that non-depressed women were much faster to notice the expression becoming happy than the women who were or had been depressed.
We've been finding that depressed people tend to guide their attention to negative things. When there are both negative and positive things happening, they'll tend to really focus on the negative. They attend to more sadness, and importantly, they remember more sadness. So those memories of sadness stay with them longer. Depressed people remember the criticism, they don't remember the praise, or they discount the praise, and they say, it just wasn't warranted, I didn't deserve it. And even things that are neutral, they tend to interpret as more negative.
Gottlieb's studies suggest that this isn't something that depressed people are conscious of doing. Rather, they just seem to be especially sensitive to negative information. One of the things that distinguishes depression from normal sadness.
These thoughts are so automatic. They're part of us. We go through the day, we have all sorts of thoughts, reactions, and I'm sure you've been in a car and 15 minutes later you're at a different intersection with no real memory of how you got from the last one to this one. But you did it, and you did it safely, but you did it outside of awareness, and you did it automatically. And for depressed people, that's what these thoughts are like. They're just automatic, knee-jerk reactions.
So we'll start with the first saliva sample. If you could take the top off of that and put the cotton swab in your mouth, and I'll time you for 3 minutes.
But why are some depressed people prone to negative thinking? In another experiment, Gottlieb set out to explore the biological underpinnings of this thinking style.
So now we're going to do a math activity. And for this task, we'll ask you to start off at the number 400 and count backwards by sevens.
He subjected a number of volunteers, some at risk for depression, some not, to a difficult mental task and measured the level of the stress hormone cortisol that was in their saliva.
Start.
400, 393, 383, 300.
That's incorrect. Please start over.
400, 393, 386, 371.
That's incorrect. Please start over.
400.
The results were clear. Under stress, people who were vulnerable to depression generally produced higher levels of cortisol than people who weren't.
In doing this, one of the things we found is that people who are depressed and people who are prone to becoming depressed are actually more biologically reactive to stressors. When they're confronted with a stressor, they have no control over it. They secrete more cortisol, the stress hormone. They don't mean to be more reactive. That's a genetic factor over which they have no control. And that goes along with this attention to negative events. There's a whole picture of just a greater reactivity to negative information. You can't learn, for example, easily to control your cortisol output, to control this stress hormone. But you can learn to respond differently to stressors. You can learn to recognize stressors, to not have a gut reaction to them as, oh my God, this is horrible, but to say, aha, now I need to do something. And that's a very different response, and it elicits a very different stress hormone response.
Psychotherapy helped Bob Antonioni realize the role stress played in his depression. But he was unprepared for his therapist's recommendation that he combine therapy with medication.
It took me several years to feel comfortable taking medication. I was afraid political opponents or the media would somehow uncover that I was taking medication, receiving therapy for depression. I would go to a drugstore that was half an hour from my house. I saw a therapist 45 miles away.
As a senator, Bob began advocating for funds to combat mental illness and prevent suicide. But he hid his own depression from all but a few close friends. Then one day, in 2003, he decided he'd had enough.
I was asked by a local reporter, why was I advocating so much for these things? And I disclosed my brother's passing and how he died by suicide. And the reporter asked, Bob, did you ever suffer from depression? I said that, yes, I have depression. And she said, are you sure you want to say that? And I said, yeah, it's the truth. The day after the story appeared, I went to a big function in Boston. All the political people were there. And I remember walking into that auditorium thinking, what an idiot. Why did I say all that? These people are going to think I'm nuts, you know? Well, let me tell you, as soon as I saw someone who knew me, they came up, hugged me. Bob, I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad you talked about this. Thank God, you know, more people are just running up to me. You know, you'd think I just won the Stanley Cup or something. And, you know, I was really taken aback. I was shocked. And I said, wow, okay, you know, thank you, thank you. I didn't know what the reaction would be from the public, but people were like, wow, thank you. You know, I'm so happy that you're talking about this. And it was, the reaction was just unbelievable. It really was. It was pretty cool. Yeah.
You've been to the bottom of this. You look like you're at the top. I mean, you look like a guy. You strike me as a person who, at least at the moment, is feeling pretty happy, pretty optimistic about the future, pretty confident in the decisions you made.
I do. I'm really happy about it. I'm very fortunate. I'm in the place where I am now because of the medication and because of the therapy. But life-changing decisions can make things easier too. Deciding not to run for re-election and to have one focus, in this case, practicing law, has made life so much more manageable and enjoyable. I'm not constantly anticipating the next shoe to fall, you know, or the next problem to arise. Now I feel like I'm more in control of things and managing things easier. There are many moments in my life now when I am happy. Bicycling promotes happiness for me. Doing fun things promotes happiness. I don't consider myself cured from depression. It's something I have to continue to deal with. But like high blood pressure or cholesterol, there's medication I can take and things that I can do so that happiness becomes more possible.
I went through like 6 or 7 years of real depression. I just couldn't quite figure out what it was, and I just was never quite given the right pill. You know, oh, put them on Prozac, put them on, that's, you know, it's still trial and error with most people, I think, who suffer from depression. But with the help of the right therapist and with the help of finally the right prescription medication, somehow I knew I'd come out of it.
I'm someone who has been on antidepressants for 15 years, and I always question, is it, not just is it good or bad, but am I making the right choices for my mind and my body?
I felt very conflicted about medication because I felt that it was some sort of a concession, that I was a failure. However, it helped me a lot. I had felt there was this sort of endless, infinite pit of despair that I had fallen into that had no bottom and that was very likely going to end in suicide. And the medication brought that up to a point where I knew I could land on that and I wasn't going to go any deeper.
It's clear that depression can have a profound effect on the way we think and feel. But there's growing evidence that it might do more than that it may affect the physical structures of our brains. Yvette Shalin, professor of psychiatry at Washington University, has been studying this possibility for over 15 years. In 1993, she began a series of experiments to see if she could find an abnormality in the brains of people with depression.
Including loss of interest in things, you just didn't care about things that used to give you pleasure. At the time that I started to do this work, the idea that there was a connection between depression and the brain was kind of anathema. I mean, people really didn't believe that. It took me 4 different times to get my grant funded because people really didn't buy that idea.
No, I can usually always sleep.
Mm-hmm.
In her studies, Shalin compared a group of women who suffered from depression with a group of women who didn't.
So what I wanted to do was to go back and talk about some of the different episodes of depression you've had throughout your life.
After a detailed psychological examination, Shalin used MRI to measure the activity in each woman's brain. She was especially interested in the part of the brain known as the hippocampus.
This is the very outer edge of the hippocampus, and as we get really close to the center of the hippocampus, this is the sort of typical seahorse shape that people talk about.
From previous studies, Shalin knew that depressed people experience elevated levels of stress hormones, and that over time, these hormones can damage the hippocampus.
The hippocampus is a very delicate part of the brain, so it gets damaged easily. It's kind of like the canary in the coal mine, a signaler of something being wrong.
After the brain scans were completed, Shalin began the painstaking task of measuring the size of each woman's hippocampus.
I was doing all this data analysis myself because I didn't have a statistician or anything at that point in time. And we finally had all the data and we got the results. I was just really excited.
A pattern emerged from the rows and rows of numbers. the hippocampus of the average depressed woman was smaller than the hippocampus of her non-depressed counterpart. A second study revealed even more disturbing news. The longer a woman had been depressed, the smaller her hippocampus tended to be.
It's evidence that this is a brain disease. It's not just a lack of willpower. It's not that people are just being lazy. It really is an illness like any other illness.
Shalene's findings remind us that mental illnesses are nothing more or less than physical illnesses that happen to impair psychological functioning.
To have a physical basis for depression, I think, really is helpful. You can say, look, this illness not only makes you feel lousy and have trouble with all these aspects of your life, but there's a physical basis in the brain, and we can show you right here. This part of the brain is affected.
Remarkably, Shalene also found that people who took antidepressants did not show hippocampal shrinkage, suggesting that the medication may actually keep the brain from being damaged by depression.
So the good news from examining treated versus untreated depression is that if you have been treated for depression, you don't get the volume reduction in hippocampus. It means it's absolutely critical to have early intervention and early treatment for depression, that the sooner you can catch it, the more likely you are to not have any hippocampal volume loss.